Why doubt the authorship of Shakespeare's works? Why should we even question the authorship of the Shakespearean canon? The very question is often met with consternation, as though doubting the traditional attribution was sacrilegious. But this dismissal itself suggests something deeper. Perhaps the mainstream argument has lost its grip, clinging to an increasingly brittle orthodoxy. For if the real author was who many of us believe he was, a towering intellect and cultural force of the Elizabethan age, then the world deserves to know him. Instead, we are left with a shadowy figure named William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, about whom we know surprisingly little. William Shakespeare was born in 1564 and died in 1616, yet there is shockingly scant evidence that he had a literary life. We know he was an actor, a shareholder in the Globe Theatre, and a member of the troupe The King's Men, but these facts do not amount to a literary career. The written record gives us 6 signatures, barely legible and differing in form, 2 lightly penned by lawyers, and 3 attached to a single document, his will. That will oddly describes him as being of sound mind and health, negating the common excuse that he was too ill to sign for himself. If these are indeed his true signatures, they suggest a man who was uncomfortable with a pen. He married Anne Hathaway at 18. She was 26. There is no definitive record that he attended the grammar school in Stratford, and had he attended, it is likely he left before completion. There is no record of travel abroad, which requires official permission at the time. And the drawing of the College of Arms lists him as a player rather than a writer. His funerary monument in Stratford originally depicted him with his hands resting on a sack of grain, a detail that was only changed decades later to include a quill and paper. The life that doesn't match the legend. This man's documented life simply does not reflect the sophistication, erudition, or experience expressed in the works of Shakespeare. We have 70 surviving documents bearing his name. None of them are literary. They describe him buying property, loaning money, acting as a broker, hoarding grain during a famine, and suing for petty debts. These are details of a savvy businessman, not the world's greatest playwright, and yet growing numbers of scholars and researchers now argue that the true author was not this grain hoarder from Stratford, but someone far more remarkable, a person of high learning, deep emotional sensitivity, and expansive knowledge. In fact, at least 7 well-known poets, authors, and public figures during Shakespeare's own lifetime seem to have been aware of this secret. They dropped hints in epigraphs, dedications, artworks, and letters, breadcrumbs left for future seekers. As Alexander Waugh has shown, the number of noblemen and scholars who knew the truth might number in the 20s. Mark Twain, in his witty critique of Shakespeare, Is Shakespeare Dead?, famously wrote, "He is a brontosaurus, 9 bones and 600 barrels of plaster of Paris." The evidence problem. Roughly half the plays now attributed to Shakespeare were published in his lifetime, some anonymously, some with his name on the title page, though often spelt differently. But a name on a title page did not necessarily mean authorship. For example, his lodger, Thomas Green, himself a writer, never mentioned Shakespeare as a fellow literary man. Michael Drayton, a prolific poet, also fails to mention him. None of his contemporaries seem to have considered him an author. Proponents of the traditional view, Stratfordians, tend to rely on vague phrases like could have, should have, probably, and may have, but ambiguity is not evidence. Shakespeare's father, John, was a glove maker, possibly also a butcher, and an alderman who could barely write. His mother, Mary, appears to have been illiterate. Literacy was widespread in Stratford. 2/3 of John's fellow aldermen could not sign their names. If William attended school, he likely left around the age of 13 when his father faced financial hardship. Yet the plays attributed to him reflect deep knowledge of Italian law and culture, Roman history, naval and military strategy, astronomy, medicine, botany, falconry, Hebrew, and even literature not yet translated into English. It has been speculated that Shakespeare was an autodidact, devouring any books he could find, but books were rare and expensive. Only about 150 were licensed for publication every year in England, mostly on law, religion, or medicine. There were no public libraries. A few private ones, notably Shakespeare left behind no books or manuscripts in his will. His daughter Judith was apparently uneducated, unable to even sign her name, a curious fact for the daughter of literature's greatest genius. Queen Elizabeth never publicly acknowledged him. As Mark Twain observes, again, Shakespeare is the most unknown person to ever grace or walk upon the planet. Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. From the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, signed by respected figures in literature and the arts, many people think that Mr. Shakespeare, a frequent spelling of his name, claimed to have written the works. No such record exists. If Mr. Shakespeare was the author, there should be definitive evidence for it from his lifetime. There is none. From 1604 to 1611, Shakespeare lived quietly in Stratford. He filed lawsuits over small debts and invested in tithes on grain and wool, more the behaviour of a tax collector than a man of letters. He was not listed among the Stratford worthies, a title reserved for local gentlemen of charitable standing. Early doubts and a telling timeline. 1589. Catherine Children highlights that Thomas Nash's preface to Green's Metaphon seems to refer to the author of Hamlet as the English Seneca. If accurate, this reference would place Hamlet's composition far earlier than traditionally accepted, and at a time when William of Stratford was just 25 and still in Stratford, effectively excluding him. 1592, Robert Greene, Groat's Worth of Wit, describes an upstart crow mockingly dubbed Shakespeare, accused of stealing others' works and claiming them as his own. This is often assumed to refer to Shakespeare, though some argue it may point to Edward Alleyn. Regardless, it hints at authorship under a pseudonym. 1595, Edward Thomas in Le Nouvre to Narcissus refers to the author of Venus and Adonis as masking in purple robes disdained, an allusion to aristocratic authorship. 1595, again, William Covell in Polymantia features a marginal note by a reader placing sweet Shakespeare beside Court de Dear Verse, an anagram for Art de Vere, a secret. 1598, various figures including John Hall, John Marsden, Gabriel Harvey and Francis Mears refer to Shakespeare in a way that suggests knowledge of the true author. Notably, Richard II was used to stir rebellion during the Essex uprising, yet the author was never questioned, a strange omission if he were a commoner. 1605, Thomas Smith refers to the recently deceased English Ovid, possibly indicating the passing of Oxford. 1609, the sonnets are published with a dedication to our ever-living poet, a possible anagram for E. Vere. 1610, John Davies in Epigram 159 refers to Shakespeare as our English Terence, a known pseudonymous front for aristocratic authorship. These and other records form more than a dozen contemporary references suggesting authorship from someone other than the man from Stratford. Some of these early doubts continue posthumously. 1624, Thomas Vickers omits Shakespeare from his list of England's greatest poets, instead cryptically referring to that famous poet who takes a name from shaking and spear. 1635, Cuthbert Burbage refers to Shakespeare merely as one of the deserving men players, acknowledging his acting role but not authorship. 1640, John Benson republishes Shakespeare's sonnets but removes any homosexual overtones and places question marks where Shakespeare's name should be. These are not always damning in isolation, but taken together they form a deeply suspicious pattern. Ross Barber's Fake Facts points to curious inconsistencies. 1. There is no balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. Balconies were only introduced into stagings after his death. Most of Shakespeare's biography is built on conjecture. The Victorian replica of his house is not historically accurate. Ben Jonson is vague about whether he truly knew Shakespeare personally. Shakespeare has no known patron. All known portraits were crafted after his death. Collaboration is often claimed, yet there is no proof of co-authorship. The 3-page edition to Sir John Moore is no longer attributed to Shakespeare by the British Library. The sheer absence of evidence about Shakespeare's literary life is unparalleled. Like the Roman poet Terence, a former slave who was the frontman for aristocratic authors, so too might the Stratford man have been a literary mask. John Davies writes to our English Terence, Mr. Will Shakespeare, hast thou not played kingly parts in sport? Thou hast been a companion of a king. This, paired with references by James Mabe, Thomas Vickers, and others, seems to underline the presence of a pseudonym. Robert Greene's infamous line, "An upstart crow beautified with our feathers," being an absolute Jonas factotum, the only shake seen in a country, accuses someone of impersonation. A theatrical man, perhaps? Or an actor used to front the works of a nobleman with much to lose by claiming authorship? With all this in mind, the question remains, who really wrote the works of Shakespeare? As we shall explore, the evidence leads us closer to a figure who had every capability, every motive, and every reason to remain hidden in the shadows.